Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're still seeing folks trickle in, but we have a lot to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Julia Kim. I'm the Climate Change Energy Program Director with CivicWell, also serving as a facilitator for ARCCA. And we're really excited to be bringing ARCCA learning sessions back online after taking a break for a couple of years. And what better topic than a topic like this as our reintroduction. Really excited to be joined by our friends over at Farallon Strategies and Climate Resolve. They'll be sharing findings from their new report, Ounce of Prevention, Advancing Equitable Climate Resilience Planning in California, a status report on the implementation of SB-379. This webinar is being recorded. You might have gotten that notice, so we will be sharing the recording along with the presentation slides as part of follow-up. And before we get started, just wanted to cover some webinar logistics. So in just a moment, I'm going to pass it over to the team to share their findings. They do have some Menti polls set up, so just a heads up, there is some engagement baked into the design of this webinar. After the presentation and after some of the polling, we will be opening things up for Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar. There's also an option to upvote any questions that have been submitted, and we'll take questions in order of interest, and we'll try to cover as many as we can. You might also notice that the chat feature is fully open. Please stay active in the chat. We'd love to see who's in the room with us. Please feel free to introduce yourself, share any reflections as the presentation gets underway. And yes, very excited to be joined by our friends. So from the Farallon Strategies team, we have Michael McCormick, who's the partnerships lead founder and president. Also Carolyn Iveas, who's the founding associate. We also have the Climate Resolve team here. We have Jonathan Parfrey, who's the founder and executive director of Climate Resolve, and Christopher Eclarino, who is a technical project manager. And with that, without further ado, Jonathan, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julia. And if it's possible, if our slide deck could also be shown at this time, that would be wonderful. We have to start at the beginning, and thanks go to the Resources Legacy Fund, who in large measure underwrote the preparation of this report. And I also would like at this time to put the URL into the chat so that people can actually see where they can view the webpage and they can download either the full report of Ounce of Prevention, or they can download the executive summary. There's two choices for you. And so I'm really pleased that you're joining us and that you have access to this report. We think it's really important. As we know that the half-life of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is 120 years. And so with every passing day, we're putting more CO2 into our atmosphere, which is making the Earth much hotter and contributing to even more impacts as the years go on. And so we are in a mode of adaptation and resilience because we have to be. And this is going to be the task of humanity. It was very exciting that in the year 2016, Senator Hannah Beth Jackson crafted the bill SB-379. And in that same year, Governor Jerry Brown signed it, and it gave California municipalities a deadline of January 2022 for compliance. So from 2016 to 2022, all 800 some municipalities in the state of California were given a deadline to be in compliance with this climate planning legislation. And you will soon hear from Mr. McCormick on exactly what the law entailed. So I also want to take a moment to thank the interviewees that we spoke to in the course of developing this report. I am very happy to see that some of them are actually on this call, including Tammy Seal. Hi, Tammy. And we have Erin Fanninstiel. Hey, Erin. And Eric DeCock, among others. So I just want to acknowledge and thank everyone for how you made this report possible, and some of the findings, I hope you will find them very valuable. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Michael McCormick. Michael.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And yes, hello, everybody. So nice to see you all here. And I have a distinct connection to SB-379. When I served in the Office of Planning and Research, I was the lead staff member working on integration of SB-379 in the general plan guidelines. So it was a fascinating work process to assess where things are in the implementation of 379, where we thought they would be when I was at OPR and crafting the guidelines. And SB-379, in short, is intended to institutionalize the consideration of climate change in local government actions and decision-making, and particularly land use. The location for that discussion, according to the legislation, was the safety element, but also acknowledging there's a cascading impact of climate adaptation and resilience across every element of a general plan. And the local hazard mitigation plan plays a critical role in prioritizing adaptation and resiliency measures in a post-disaster dynamic and in context of funding opportunities related to hazard mitigation. When we talk about SB-379, most people think about the safety element, but really we should be thinking about every element of a general plan. And in that end, if you look in the general plan guidelines, the most recently adopted in 2017 with some amendments since then, including an environmental justice update and a few updates to safety element requirements, you'll see a mention to adaptation and resilience in every chapter of the general plan guidelines. That's very intentional because it's intended to tie together the goals, policies, and actions of communities to really consider climate risk, how to address that risk through an equitable lens, and longer term, how to prepare the community for a changing climate. And we do that through three different ways: a vulnerability assessment, identifying the risks that climate change poses to the local jurisdiction, a set of goals, policies, and objectives on a vulnerability assessment for the protection of the community, and of course, the third being a set of feasible implementation strategies. And it's interesting, when you look at general plan law, it's very rare when legislation or statute refers to implementation of feasible strategies. And I just kind of a wonky perspective on legislation, and that this bill actually requires implementation. And the guidance that's established here on the screen through the Adaptation Policy Guide is really the preferred mechanism to do that within the city and county context. Provides a structure for how to go through the process, looking at defining and exploring vulnerabilities, assessing that vulnerability in context to the specific community dynamic, looking at adaptation through a longer term framework, including strategies and implementation measures, and then monitoring and evaluating and adjusting over time. Every one of these phases should include outreach and engagement. And as we all know, if you have worked within the general plan context, there's requirements around community engagement, and then there's the intent around community engagement. And I think the intent is oftentimes much larger than the requirements. And so we have seen that as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But very excited to be here to share some of our findings and conclusions.
Thanks, Michael. I will now begin by providing our report's findings and conclusions, starting with the question, have jurisdictions complied with SB 379? Using ICARP's Resilient California data accessed in August of 2022, we found that only half of Californian jurisdictions have updated their safety elements to address climate change. And also from our research, including stakeholder interviews and looking at the data itself, we found that most non-compliant jurisdictions lack the financial and staff resources to engage in planning. Next slide. And on this slide, we have a breakdown of the completed assessments as of August 2022 by city and county level. The pie chart shows that after 4 years after the passage of SB 379, only 7% of cities and 24% of counties had an updated and adopted safety element that complied with SB 379. Many are still updating their safety elements, and other jurisdictions are taking incorporation by reference through the general plan approach to comply with SB 379. And now I'll turn it over to Carolyn to provide an overview on our findings of climate planning approaches.
Sorry, didn't realize I was muted while presenting. Thanks, Chris. So another key question that we sought to answer through this research was what climate planning approach proved most effective. So what we saw is that the standalone adaptation plan, as resource intensive as they can be, are very detailed and have the potential to lead to the transformative implementation projects that we would like to see advance these resilient outcomes. The local hazard mitigation plan updates were cost-effective approaches to SB 379 compliance, integrating by reference, but they have limitations in how much direct implementation pathways they provide to cities and counties. Often they're higher level policy documents. There's also a question of CEQA and whether or not jurisdictions actually, apply CEQA to their LHMPs. So there are limitations, although many jurisdictions were going that route due to the cost effectiveness, especially smaller jurisdictions. Updates to the general plan were the most effective. So that's the safety element, primarily update of that safety element, but also integrating climate adaptation considerations into other elements, including housing, where houses are, where new housing is sited, land use. Those are very important elements to be considered. And also just in terms of general approaches, that forming trusted relationships with community leaders was very important in integrating community values into climate adaptation planning. So the extent to which cities could actually partner with CBOs or other trusted community partners to do the community outreach, we saw that allowed for more of the community values, whether that be environmental justice components that were related to climate adaptation, prioritizing vulnerable communities, what projects that would actually provide communities with the resilient outcomes that they deemed important. That was the most important aspect was the partnership with community leaders. I think I'm turning it back to Michael.
Thanks, Carolyn. And, when we look at the cascading impact of climate change across communities, we also have to think about, from an implementation standpoint, is the requirement to address climate adaptation and resilience in a general plan actually having an impact on where it matters most, which is on the implementation side. And as our current president often references, don't tell me your values, show me your budget. And your budget oftentimes represents the priorities of a community. And you look all the way at the bottom of this chart, and when you think about the connection between your higher level planning documents and how you get work done within a local government, the capital improvement plans play a really critical role in that, as do developments and entitlements. So thinking about the nexus with housing and looking at annual budgets through the lens of the future state of climate, the environmental conditions to come, not just the environmental conditions on the ground in that current moment. So one of the things that I think we're all excited about is not just compliance with SB 379 at the statutory level within a general plan, but also how that's tied through specific plans, through your bike and pedestrian plans, through your environmental permitting processes and your zoning ordinances, through your grading codes, and all the way down to your CIPs. And for the most part, what we found was that people are still in the early stages of institutionalizing consideration of climate in their communities. And that oftentimes lands at that top level of planning documentation.
Thanks, Michael. And something that we really wanted to draw attention to in this report is that there's some serious complexity in addressing SB 379. There's a lot of different plans, and although some jurisdictions go the route of doing one standalone climate adaptation plan to kind of get everything in one place, the real where it meets the road is in integrating into all these plans so that every respective department, every respective plan is like aligned in prioritizing climate adaptation and resilience. So this is a graphic. Both Michael and I had worked with the city of Watsonville in doing a plan integration approach when it comes to SB 379 compliance that started with a local hazard mitigation plan that, in addition to addressing 379, address new legislation around AB 747 and SB-99, which is around evacuation route planning related to adaptation. And that was integrated into the climate action and adaptation plan. Those climate projections and the climate action and adaptation strategies were then moved, integrated and cross-referenced with the safety elements plans and the environmental justice elements, or safety elements and its environmental justice elements. And then you also saw singular plans that were more implementation focused that came out of these efforts, like the green infrastructure plan that took some of the higher level policy found in the local hazard mitigation plan and the climate adaptation plan and put it into action in the design of green infrastructure projects. So just a graphic to show that these are, real difficult endeavors to really get the policy alignment across a range of documents. Next is have jurisdictions actually implemented their climate resilience plans. So, half of it is planning, and that's a big piece of it. And I think a ton of resources historically have gone to cities and counties who are trying to plan for climate change, understand the climate projections, do the vulnerability assessment. But it's past 2022 and we're now on to the implementation phase. And you see the state also prioritizing grant programs that are really focused on implementation. How do we actually get these projects off the ground? And we found that capacity and institutional continuity are huge concerns across state, local government, nonprofit, consultancies, and academia to act on the work that is needed to establish the policy and then implement that policy. So across the board, capacity constraints is the barrier. And ultimately, it is too soon to tell if SB 379 will effectively create new implementation programs. I think this is a really instrumental year. Again, there are a lot more grant funding opportunities for that implementation and more of a focus on regional coordination and collaboration, focusing on how jurisdictions, CBOs, nonprofits can work together to actually implement projects rather than just meet that planning requirement and thresholds. And then this is also just illuminating climate adaptation, resilience, the cascading policy of just how, how high level adaptation policy starts and how it can trickle down to actually reach that implementation phase and how many kind of tiers it must go through to reach that implementation phase. So this graphic, I think, was offered by BCDC, if that's right, Michael. I should put a credit in that. But starting with like a local hazard mitigation plan or a standalone plan, all of these general plan elements have to be updated or to integrate climate adaptation and resilience. And then you move on to the specific plans where you really see that implementation phase. So this is just kind of one route of many that you see jurisdictions kind of moving through these levels to actually reach the implementation phase of SB 379.
So people are not really supposed to pay attention to that chart. It's just showing complexity, I think, is the main idea. So how do cities comply with updating their general plans? They often turn to consultants. And how did that relationship go with SB 379? We should mention there were some plans that were done internally by municipal staff, and I'll touch on that at the very end of this slide. But first of all, we wanted to note that there are regional climate planning efforts that have taken place. The Southern California Association of Government did a robust one with ESA. ESA was also part of a planning effort at the Gateway Cities COG called the Gateway Cities Climate Action Planning Framework. They did a great job there. PlaceWorks and Atlas Planning did Resilient IE Toolkit that also was this kind of like big picture cross jurisdictional analysis that's taken place. Here's the question. Did those meta-analyses get used by the cities themselves? Did it give them a leg up to have some of their homework done? The answer is mixed. So, for example, when the city of Paramount was having its climate action plan updated by ESA, ESA used ESA's global planning framework. But did other cities using other consultants end up accessing that sort of regional planning effort? The answer was no. And the same with the Inland Empire analysis. So if the principals who created it were doing the local plans, yes, those regional analysis were indeed employed. But if it was some other consultant, unfortunately, the answer was no. So that's one really important point to keep in mind. The other one I want to bring up was the trade-offs in municipalities doing either choosing consultants or doing it in-house. So one of our examples that we hold up is the County of Los Angeles and their exceptional performance of updating their general plan by the Department of Regional Planning. Just superb. And they did that entirely in-house, including their outreach efforts, which was very notable. But many, many others do rely on consultancies to perform a variety of different services, from vulnerability assessments to land use analyses. And so we found that there was a trade-off between the capacity internal to a municipality with agency staff and trying to have that understanding of what climate change means for that city to be passed on from one person to the other, so it kind of becomes part of the culture of the city. We found, and we'll be talking about this later, that there's such little capacity at these cities, and people keep moving on from one position to the next, that there is kind of a breakdown that happens. We had one consultant tell us, a person who doesn't live in Southern California, saying, I am the repository of knowledge for this city. Rather stunning statement, because they didn't have that capacity internally. And that's something that we feel needs to be addressed. Michael.
Thank you, Jonathan. You know, you're kind of giving a preview of the last set of recommendations that we have as well. And so I'm going to jump in on our recommendations. It was, we have a fair number of them. We call them the big four because there are 4 high-level sets of recommendations. And the first is the crisis of capacity. This is no surprise to any local government that is on the call right now, or candidly, nonprofits, CBOs, for-profit consulting firms, the state of California, our federal partners. Everybody is struggling with capacity in order to do a good job of not just analyzing the impacts of climate change on their communities and having the resources to go through the process of compliance, but the real world implementation of the consideration of climate vulnerability and risk and addressing equitable adaptation and resilience is a huge driver of capacity need. And you know, one of the key things that we've identified is that there is not enough informed, engaged workforce to actually do all of the work that's necessary. The work that's necessary now and the work that's going to be necessary in the future. We've seen this with several of the funding programs that have come out, and oftentimes organizations may not even have the capacity to apply for the funding. And if they do receive the funding, they'll be very challenged to actually do the implementation on the projects that they're receiving funding to do without some significant external support. Just highlighting, you know, Jonathan's previous points on some of the jurisdictions in our state really must have external support in order to implement internal priorities around adaptation and resilience. And with workforce development, there's a big opportunity to get in front of the demand on our community of practice in the coming years. Amending legislation to allow reference to regional vulnerability assessments is another one. Every local government in the state doing their own vulnerability assessment really makes no sense. Climate change is not it's not driven by a geopolitical boundary. It is not driven by city and county boundaries, right? Climate change is something that is inherently regional and global. And so each local government doing their own vulnerability assessment is a pretty significant resource strain on communities. And having regions do that in support of local governments is really critical. We do acknowledge and support certainly the development of the Regional Resilience Grant Program from the Office of Planning and Research, which has just released their RFP, which is very exciting. And also the Climate Change Fifth Assessment for California is leaning into supporting regional assessments as well. But right now there is not a specific funding or capacity building program to support regional vulnerability assessments that would meet SB-379 standards. And block grants to that extent is another place where we have found huge potential. Acknowledging every city and county in the state is required to address SB-379. Having funding available to actually meet some of those requirements could be really critical, not in a competitive framing, but through block grants that are provided to every jurisdiction in the state, whether it be cyclical, annual, depending on the funding opportunities available. But we would be really excited to further talk with the state and our federal partners on how that could occur. And then lastly, in this first block of the big four is supporting existing climate collaboratives and technical assistance programs. We see really good progress from the work that the Strategic Growth Council stood up through the BOOST program, now through the Regional Climate Collaboratives program, but also acknowledging, as we are on the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation workshop series call right now, there are existing collaboratives that have been built over the last decade plus that have already added capacity to regions, and being able to acknowledge and lift them into a more impactful role is quite a significant opportunity for the state. And I think the other piece that's mentioned that isn't explicitly mentioned here, but last year there was a report published by the California Resilience Partnership that highlighted capacity issues and opportunities to fund resilience across the state in a more strategic and in some cases tactical way to drive equity into their investments from the state of California. And that's called the Climate Crossroads Report. And if anybody has a link to that, otherwise I'll drop the link right after this. It's on the Resilient Cities Catalyst website, which was one of the partners on the report. So yeah, crisis of capacity. So I will hand it over to Carolyn to keep talking with us about this. And we've got a poll.
So if everyone is able to go to menti.com and use the code 28877784, we would love to hear which of those recommendations under the bucket crisis of capacity resonates most with you.
Yeah, so let's just give it one more minute here, and yeah, drop a link in the chat. That would be great. And so let me just walk through this real quick. So the first is investing in workforce development and retention. The second, amending legislation to allow reference to regional vulnerability assessments as a viable option for vulnerability assessments. The third being providing block grants or sustainable funding to help build capacity in communities and the expectation of funding being available to do the work. And then lastly, supporting existing climate collaboratives and technical assistance programs. Let's not recreate the wheel. Look to that existing infrastructure to build from. And look at this, we are getting some good responses.
We're still moving, so I'll give it another 10 seconds. I don't think I've ever seen a Menti this much. It's great. All right. So it looks like things are changing slightly, but mostly, oh, trying to close tie between second and third. But the first being providing block grants or sustainable funding has stayed #1 for the duration of this period. So yeah, really excited. If you have any like commentary to add, feel free to put it in the chat. And if you have any questions about this bucket of recommendations, feel free to post it in the Q&A and we'll try to get it to it in the Q&A portion of the presentation. All right, I'm moving us along.
Oh, wait, let's give about 15 or 20 seconds because I know I just entered my vote. So we'll keep going here. Last 10 seconds. And if you couldn't get on Menti, feel free to drop a note into the chat about what you're feeling strongly about on this first set of the 4 big 4.
All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us along. Thanks, everyone. Ooh. So some already moved on to the next Menti. Starting it, interesting. So the state should enable counties, MPOs, and COGS to create climate vulnerability assessments for local jurisdictions to fulfill SB-379 requirements. So this is kind of getting to that previous question. You know, that was one of our key recommendations, was to provide, you know, allow for regional organizations or counties, a higher level of governments, to provide a regional vulnerability assessment that local jurisdictions could reference. And that would allow them to focus more on implementation plans and programs, projects. But kind of curious how our audience is feeling about this recommendation in a very explicit statement of whether the state should enable counties, MPOs, and COGS to create that regional vulnerability assessment. For those strongly disagreeing, would love to hear some commentary in the chat, as well as those who strongly agree.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I came in with a little bit of a bias on the questions on MPOs and COGS is when I was at OPR and in 2013 approached CalCog about whether they were interested in developing vulnerability assessments through MPOs and COGS. I got a strong no. And since then, that perspective has certainly evolved. Certainly some of the MPOs in the state and the COGS in the state that are actively working on climate have been very impactful in their regions to bring knowledge, information, data, tools, capacity into their communities. And then others have not stepped forward into that strong leadership space. I think one of the things that I've been really excited about is seeing partnerships with the regional collaboratives and the MPOs and COGS in co-developing solutions at the governance side of things, the more formal governance side of things through regional agencies, and then the partnership and deployment of resources through the regional collaboratives. And that I think shows a real maturing of our industry, the ability for people to work together, oftentimes from different backgrounds and different perspectives. And it's been, 10 years since I had that conversation. So my thinking has certainly evolved as well in the importance of all people being in the space and being very impactful wherever you can. Everything, everywhere, all at once, so to speak. I don't know, Jonathan, or Carolyn or Chris, if you have other perspectives on that, or Julia.
As someone who's done a lot of work around SB-379 compliance for local jurisdictions and have definitely tried to the extent possible reference regional analyses, I think that one benefit of allowing for that reference is a more focused time capacity spent on community engagement around what solutions communities really want to prioritize. So given how limited local jurisdictions capacity can be, allowing that attention and focus to be towards engagements, building partnerships with community-based organizations, and focusing on what solutions, whether that's projects, programs, and other implementation measures should be prioritized is something that I can see as a potential benefit. But thanks for everyone for putting in their results. We have a few more buckets of recommendations to go through, so I'm going to move us along. I think I'm going to pass this to Chris.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I'll give a brief overview of our second set of recommendations regarding creating efficiencies of scale. In our research, we found that there is such a thing as over-planning. We found that some regions repetitively write climate assessments arriving at the same conclusions. Our team came up with 4 recommendations to address this, to create efficiencies of scale in climate preparedness planning. First, distribute adaptation planning work appropriately between local and the regional level. We think by supporting the development of regional vulnerability assessments and plan, the state can reduce the planning mandates on individual municipalities, thereby allowing jurisdictions to focus on more narrow plans that advance specific resilience projects and programs. Our second is providing specific plan alignment guidance across general plans, local hazard mitigation plans, climate adaptation plans, and local coastal plans. We think that the state should update guidance to align with the competing and often contradictory timelines of other related planning requirements. Third, developing effective partnership models. A partnership model at a local and regional level should be evaluated and shared to enable local governments to contract with CBOs to develop a community-driven planning process and lead in public engagement. And it would allow for local jurisdictions and CBOs to effectively contribute to and guide regional planning processes without draining resources and capacity. And finally, fourth is allowing OPR review authority of SB-379, similar to Cal OES, informally reviewing plans for compliance, local hazard mitigation, plans to see if they're in compliance with those requirements. We think that allowing OPR review authority would allow a state agency to hold jurisdictions accountable for meeting requirements to implement plans. And next slide. And we have another Menti poll on which of those 4 recommendations would resonates most with you. First, distribute adaptation planning work appropriately between local and regional level. Second, providing specific plan alignment guidance. Third, developing effective partnership models, CBOs. And fourth, designated review authority of SB-379 compliance to OPR.
Yeah, and just some quick context on that last item too, for the OPR review authority. OPR is a repository of general plans, but does not have a review and approval authority for general plans. We see housing elements, they go through the HCD review and approval process, local hazard mitigation plans, they go through a review and approval process through Cal OES. And functionally, with Cal OES now requiring conversations of adaptation resilience and LHMPs, and that being an alternate compliance mechanism for 379 compliance and general plans, we see Cal OES kind of taking an informal review role for 379 compliance. And so one of the things is intended by this recommendation is to provide clarity around where that requirement fits in statute, which is squarely in general plan statute, but also acknowledging that there have been no challenges to safety elements that I'm aware of to date for compliance questions. This was a question we got in our Q&A about whether there has been legal challenges at this point. And as you all know, the work at the local level with a particularly litigious environment in land use and planning in California that is a little bit surprising. But also, creating an expectation of a certain level of performance for the plans that are being written is really important. And because otherwise there is a drift towards kind of the less impactful type of plans and programs that may not truly be addressing the risk that's being identified through vulnerability assessments. And there's plenty of history to show a few challenges, and some creation of review authority certainly provides a strong support mechanism for a community of practice to do better.
All right, looks like first is distributing the work between local and regional level. Second is the plan alignment guidance. And then third and fourth are partnership models and designating review authority. I'm gonna go to the next slide. So this is just oh, go ahead, Chris, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say relevant to this course, this one is if the state should allow OPR to exert review authority over climate adaptation plans to address SB-379.
Yeah, just highlighting a point within the comments from OPR, basically saying that OPR does not have review authority, and that is the case right now. OPR does not. So the recommendation is for the legislature to provide that authority to OPR.
Thanks everyone for those of you who are participating. This is the first time we're able to kind of ground truth some of these recommendations. So it's really interesting for us to be able to see these live results. All right, I'll give it maybe 10 more seconds and then move us along. So
I also want to draw attention to Eric's comment in the chat on what OPR has been doing in terms of providing guidance. OPR has provided guidance over the years, but when an SB-379 general plan update is submitted, currently OPR doesn't have the opportunity to say if they like it or don't like it, or if it needs work. And that's the authority that we were seeking.
Yeah, and certainly the technical assistance support for folks grappling with how best to do this in their own communities is very helpful from OPR, but there's limited capacity to OPR right now to provide that robust support that's needed as well. Okay, so on to the next set. So this is the third set of the big four. So funding climate planning at the local level. Right, no surprise, this is a set of recommendations. And I think anybody that was involved in responding to the adaptation planning grant program from OPR recognize the huge opportunity that plays. We also saw that only 9% of the applicants, I think it was either 7 or 9% of the applicants were actually funded. And that is a huge oversubscription of a very important program to get people to not just compliance, but actually getting this work done on the ground. So renewing and expanding OPR's adaptation planning grant program is one of our key recommendations in the funding space. Also allowing flexibility in funding towards local climate planning. We see a lot of funding for implementation, for projects, for infrastructure, and really allowing some flexibility in funding to help support local climate action planning, not just in OPR's programs or ICARP's programs, but also in other programs provided by the state of California, provided by the federal government, really allowing for climate planning to occur so that people can have a starting point for that work that needs to happen next. Renewing funding in SGC's Boost program. We put this in the category of funding climate planning, but providing technical assistance for local governments to create an extension of their team, an extension of their staff has been really successful. Both Climate Resolve and Farallon Strategies, full disclosure, have been supporting the Boost program and have found it to be a really productive tool in both building knowledge in communities about how to do this assessment now and into the future, and then getting folks over that capacity hump to actually get the work done and out the door. So expanding those TA programs across the state to be able to support more communities could be a key way for implementation to occur. Another is leveraging private philanthropy. Philanthropy has not really been at the table significantly on the climate adaptation and resiliency side of things. There's a limited number of philanthropic entities in the state of California that have been providing support and funding. And historically, we do need to acknowledge that some of the work that's been done was seed funded by philanthropy, oftentimes out of state philanthropy, like the Kresge Foundation helped to establish many of the community or the collaboratives that are working in the state of California now in the mid 2010s. In fact, right now, under the generous support of the Hilton Foundation, the California Resilience Partnership, and the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation has been building significant capacity in the community of practice. But there's so much more to be done. So leveraging private philanthropy to do things that government funding can't do, to help build the practice, to help build the case studies that truly innovate our community of practice and innovate in how we can do things into the future.
Michael, with your permission, I would like to just make a finer point of that. Through a grant by Southern California Edison, Climate Resolve, working with a local consultancy, was able to submit a grant for climate planning for the city of San Fernando, which was awarded. But we were able to do that because there was this underwriting performed by Southern California Edison. In the same way, Southern California Gas Company gave funding to Los Angeles County so that their regional planning could perform their really robust climate planning effort to update their general plans. So there has been a role of utilities and private philanthropy engaging in ways that leverage their dollars to draw down more in the future.
All right, I think we've got good responses here. Why don't we move to the next slide? Thanks, everybody. Jonathan.
I will unmute. So the final suite of recommendations is trying to find a way to allow the smaller jurisdictions the ability to be in compliance without having to spend a king's ransom to develop a local plan. And so I'll start with the smaller jurisdictions. If we picked a number of 80,000 residents within an area, they should take advantage of work that's being performed by either a COG or by an NPO or by the county, or even the region. I see this in the Q&A, some of the fifth assessment regional assessments that are taking place, to be able to incorporate that data to be in compliance with a climate assessment. And then they should be able to comply in that regard, mostly through the local hazard mitigation plans. If they're a larger city, it's our view that they should go through the exercise of updating their general plans, updating their LHMPs as well. But for the largest jurisdictions, we are really big fans of the adaptation planning process, which we think unearths a lot more information, has a much more robust community engagement aspect. And that's something that we believe very strongly in. So for the counties, for the larger cities, to do a full adaptation plan, in our view, makes the most sense. But we also want to give some relief to some of the smaller jurisdictions that just don't have the resources to comply that way. And so here you have the ability to vote. Do you think it's okay to have people comply in different ways depending on the size of the jurisdiction? And I'd also like to draw folks' attention to Aaron Coots's comments in the chat about the SoCal gas planning grants if you're within their service territory.
Well, I think we'd love to get to some Q&A, so I'll give it another 5 seconds on this screen. We'll record all of the poll questions for this webinar that we asked via the Menti, but I know I see at least 5 Q&A popped up, so I'm going to maybe turn it to Julia to help us facilitate that section. But thank you everyone for your participation.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks, everyone. Definitely encourage folks to explore this report a little further. I certainly plan to do another deep dive. Again, just thank you for being here and presenting. I know a lot of questions were answered just through the module itself, but we still have a handful of open questions. We'll see how much we can cover. So starting at the top here, any evidence that cities, counties, and regions are using state climate adaptation data tools and research like CalAdapt, like the fourth climate assessment reports? Any thoughts on other data tools that the state could provide to address capacity needs?
I'll just jump in really quick and then I'll pass it to Jonathan. But I think it's not so much that, yes, there's overwhelmingly, we are using these tools, but it's navigating these tools. There's actually an abundance of tools we're finding. Doesn't stop at CalAdapt. There's a Healthy Places Index. There's a bunch of different like social vulnerability indices. There's the state assessments, and then there's also regional assessments. So which ones do you choose to reference? So I think it's a lot of it, the work of the consultant or the TA provider is helping local government staff navigate the plethora of resources that do exist and choosing what's most appropriate, especially for the vulnerability assessments. Jonathan?
And I just want to say that some of the consultants have their own proprietary analyses associated with it, which makes candidly a handoff to the city or perhaps to another consultant in the future a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, and certainly some of the LHMP-driven vulnerability and adaptation analyses leveraged consultant templates that were more appropriate at the national scale versus the California-specific dynamic. And so one of the items to think about in the context of an OPR review and approval role is also in the tools and template side of things, is how do we make it easier for folks to do things that are more consistent across the state so that there can be a real roll-up of risk, hazards, and an alignment around how we address those risks over time.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if we can get to this next one. About the challenge of misaligned timelines as it comes to various plans and the timeline for updating those. So any recommendations on how to course correct for specific plan alignment, whether you're newer at an organization, maybe you can't successfully break down silos, maybe there's another hurdle that you're facing, but yeah, how to best align planning documents, what can be done if certain documents won't be updated for some time. I'm not sure if this was reviewed as part of your report, but I also know there's a lot of planning experience on this webinar here.
Some strong opinions. Carolyn, you want to start? We all have strong opinions on this one.
Yeah, I'll start really quickly. I just want to interject that what I've found in providing consulting and advice to local jurisdictions is what determines what type of plan they address SB-379 via is largely up to like what plan is up for update next. If they have an LHMP grant, then it's going to be addressed via the LHMP. If they're already updating their housing elements, that's opening up the safety elements, then they're going to address it through the safety element. So a lot of this predetermination of like what's the best approach, in reality, it's based off of where is their funding to update the next plan. And then from there, that starts the course of adaptation planning, and then the sequence kind of begins from there. Whether that's the best approach, I don't know, but that seems to be kind of like the reality on the ground.
Yeah, and certainly the ideal scenario is that an entire general plan is being updated, and you integrate climate adaptation and risk resilience throughout the entire general plan update. But the reality is that just very rarely happens. I do think there's a disconnect currently with housing elements. HCD is trying to provide some support through their comments, but if we're not doing land use and housing and transportation through the lens of climate risk, then we're not truly addressing climate risk as intended through SB-379.
And I'll jump in. I'll be the activist here. If there is a jurisdiction that is out of compliance, and if they have not actually done the work before January of 2022, they are open to a lawsuit brought by an individual or an organization. They're out of compliance. So if we do not give OPR the authority to do the work of validating these plans, it'll be done by the courts. And my preference is for it to be done professionally rather than a judge evaluating whether, how good their understanding is of climate resilience. So I feel very strongly that there needs to be greater compliance other than 50%. 50%, and most of those have been through LHMPs. And it hasn't been through the actual climate planning process. Michael and I did not go into great detail on this topic, but there is a substantive difference between climate planning and compliance through an emergency management plan through an LHMP. And what we want is both. We want both because they have different needs and different targets.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's going to be the final word as we start to wrap up here. Obviously, there's so much more to discuss. I don't know, maybe this will be an ongoing series depending on any updates to the reports, if there's anything planned. We're going to try to get folks out on time. I just want to thank everyone again for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to drop in the chat the link to the Ounce of Prevention report. Do take a look if you haven't already. And we hope you can also join us for our next learning session, which is happening just next week. We'll be launching the San Diego Regional Coastal Resilience Roadmap with San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative and the Resilient Cities Catalyst. So hope to see you there. And then in case it's not already on your radar, the 2023 California Adaptation Forum is happening this summer in Pomona. So hopefully you'll be there and we'll get to connect live and in person. So thanks again for spending this past hour with us. Huge thanks to each of our presenters. We'll follow up with the webinar recording, the slides, and we'll also try to package up the chat and question responses. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you.
Everyone.
Always.